Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for welcoming me here. Um, so, uh, I was 20 weeks pregnant with our second child, and my daughter was 2 years old at the time when I got pregnant with our second. And at the 20-week ultrasound, I was diagnosed with something called a placenta previa, which is basically where the placenta is growing on top of the cervix. It's not a huge ordeal. It's a 1 in 200 risk. The worst thing that they worry about is if you bleed a little bit, you might have to have some bed rest. But then worst case scenario is you have a C-section. I had a C-section with my last one, but the only complication I had was that she was so big that she wouldn't come out after 14 hours of labor. So they had to do the C-section. But no other issue, went back to work, no problem, So when the doctor told me that I had placenta previa, I immediately sat back and I looked at my husband. I said, I've got a bad feeling about this. And my husband's a PhD economist from University of Chicago. He was a former Air Force pilot. He's very linear, very analytical, a statistician, if you will. And he looks at me and he's like, Stephanie, we don't have all the information. So, why don't we get information before you start worrying about it? I said, look, I'm rare in the blood category. I'm O negative. I said, I don't want to be special in any other category. And there was just this overwhelming knowing that I had that this was not going to end well. So Dr. Google goes home and starts researching everything about a placenta previa. And what I learned is in some cases, a placenta previa can turn into an accreta, which is when the placenta merges itself with the uterus. If that happens, you might bleed. If that happens, you might need a hysterectomy. If that happens, you might hemorrhage. And the worst case scenario is you and the baby could lose your lives. And I looked at my husband and I said, this is going to happen to us. The only difference is the baby's going to be fine, but I will be dead on the operating table. So of course he's like, what you are afraid of is a half of a percent chance of happening. Don't think worst case scenario. This is not going to happen. We're in good hands. You're doing great prenatal care. This is ridiculous. But like I said, I didn't waver. I knew. So he wasn't listening to me. So I'm like, I went into action. I told my doctors, I told the nurses, every visit I went to, I'm like, my placenta previa is going to turn in accreta. You're going to need to give me hysterectomy. I'm going to hemorrhage. You're going to need a lot of blood. I'm going to be cut from sternum to pelvis. I'm going to be dead on the operating table. Baby's going to be fine, by the way. And I very matter of fact. So of course, at every visit, everybody's like, crazy woman's rolling her eyes. This woman's crazy, hormonal, pregnant. You know, I remember going to one of my doctors, and in their defense, they did do tests. They did ultrasounds. Everything was negative. So my husband was comfortable with the data that he was receiving. But it still sat wrong with me that it was still in my body that this was going to happen. I mean, at one point, I was taking my daughter for a stroll and the fountain was dry. It was winter. And I was explaining to her how the fountain would look as it's flowing. And, in my mind's eye, that flowing turned to blood. And I had a visceral reaction of that blood. I felt my body hemorrhage. So I held on to the stroller and I called my husband and I said, meet me at the hospital. I'm hemorrhaging. So I go to the hospital, they triage me. The doctor's like, Miss Arnold, are you okay? And I'm like, no, obviously I'm hemorrhaging. And they're like, no, you're not. And my husband's like, okay, great, false alarm. And I'm like, no, this is a warning. I was so confident about everything that I just didn't shut up. So they got tired of hearing from me. I mean, I called my doctor at one point and I said, if I need a hysterectomy when I deliver, who does that? They said, well, we would transfer you to maternal fetal medicine, but Stephanie, please don't think this way because it's not going to happen. I said, well, talk to me through that. Well, a gyn-onc is actually the best person to do it because they are more familiar with high risk reproductive organ surgery because there's 20% of your blood supply going to the uterus. And when that happens, it's better that a gyn-onc would actually do the hysterectomy during an emergent situation, but please don't, just stop thinking about it. So I made an appointment with the head of gynecological oncology at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. And I pushed my way in, and I am in the waiting room, and my husband is looking at me like I am crazy. And, he went with me to every single one of my appointments, probably because he didn't want to get divorced. And he is sitting next to me, and we are looking at these women who are suffering from cancer, and they have IVs in their arm, and they have no hair and no eyebrows. And he's like, I am embarrassed to be here. And I said, I don't know what to tell you, but nobody is listening to me. And I know that this is going to happen. And maybe this doctor has heard something about this kind of impending doom. And maybe there's something else going on that no one else can see, but maybe this doctor has seen it. So we do the consultation. I'm sitting in there with the doctor and with his resident. And he's taking notes. He says to me, now this is the head of gynecological oncology, right? The worst reproductive organ cancers. And I am sitting there as a pregnant, healthy 7-month pregnant woman. And he's like, how can we help you, Mrs. Arnold? I said, well, I see you, you see me. My husband was like, it was very mafia-like. I see you, you see me, you're my doctor, right? And then I said, my placenta previa is going to turn to accreta. I need a hysterectomy, and you are going to do the hysterectomy when I deliver this baby. He's like, have you been diagnosed with an accreta? No. Why are you sent here? Because I know this is going to happen. Mr. Arnold, have you been on the internet? Why, yes, I have, doctor, but this is going to happen. So he's like, okay, why don't we get an MRI and see if it's positive for an accreta? And if it is, then I will schedule myself the day of your delivery. Perfect. Now I felt better because I had something to do, because my thinking was maybe there was something physiologically happening in the body that was sending a signal, and the MRI would pick it up because the ultrasound was not. So I do the MRI is negative for an accreta. My husband says, you should feel better. I said, I don't. I feel worse because I'm running out of people to tell my crazy foreboding story to. So my doctor says, do you want to have a consultation with anesthesia? Yes, I want to talk to whoever will listen to me. So the anesthesiologist answers the phone. Her name is Dr. Grace Lim. She's like, how can I help you? She goes through the plan of like recovery, when you deliver, epidural, all these things. I said, okay, I know that. But what happens in the end that this, and this happen? And she was startled by that conversation, but she said, Mrs. Arnold, you're in a teaching hospital and we're prepared for worst case scenarios. So I hope I made you feel better. And I said, it is what it is, because that was the last doctor I could talk to. So then when I tell you that if you saw me walking down the street, because this happened a couple of times, I went into Starbucks, woman's like, how's your pregnancy going? I'm like, I'm going to die. It was so matter of fact. I mean, I took to Facebook, I posted, if anybody has my blood type, I'm going to need it. And this was like a month before I delivered. I wrote goodbye letters. I sent out goodbye letters. I told everybody what was going to happen in a few weeks' time. And then 36 weeks to the day, my husband is out of town. I'm supposed to deliver at the 37-week mark. 36 weeks to the day, I start bleeding in the kitchen floor. And we get in the car because I know that today's the day I'm going to deliver this baby. And everything was happening in slow motion. But if you imagine being buried alive and there's a timer and you have a time limit for your expiration date, that was what I was going for. Beyond stressful, because I'm trying to save my life and no one is believing me. Everybody sees an open road, everything's clear and beautiful, and all I see is this 18-wheeler headed straight for me. So I go into the hospital, I get triaged. My husband's on a plane coming back from New York, and I'm Skype chatting with him, and I'm texting him, and I'm telling him that he's made me the happiest woman in the world, and to please love this child, love our children. And I'm basically saying goodbye, and he's still not getting it. He's like, where do I meet you? I said, 8th floor recovery, hopefully. And then I hug my daughter a million times because I'm convinced it's the last time I'm going to see her. And then I get gurneyed down the hallway. And I tell my doctor one more time, there's something wrong. You need to put me under general anesthesia. She said, I'm not going to do that because I'll put the baby to sleep. Stephanie, I know you're nervous because Jonathan is not here, but we'll take good care of you. And if you're having an elective surgery and you have a form of foreboding and you say it out loud, an anesthesiologist is going to stop everything and say, let's just stop this procedure for a moment, right? Let's reset. but I'm being wheeled into the room that's going to give life to my son and take mine. And it is so palpable that I know I can't run away from this. So when you have a C-section, they put a curtain in front of your face, your arms are in a T form, there's IVs in, and then they begin to the delivery. They deliver a healthy baby boy, and seconds later, I'm dead. I flatlined for 37 seconds, and it was only 37 seconds because the OR was prepared with extra blood in a crash cart. And the reason why that is my anesthesiologist that I had a phone consult with several weeks before said she was uncomfortable with what I was saying. She said she had never had a patient speak so clearly about what was going to happen, had had a baby before, had had a C-section, and sought out specialists to save her life. And with that one phone call, she flagged my file and incorporated extra blood in a crash cart in the operating room. And that is 100% what saved my life. Well, correction, I spoke up, and that helped save my life. So what I ended up having was an amniotic fluid embolism. It's a very rare 1 in 40,000 risk where amniotic cells get into the mother's bloodstream. And if you happen to be allergic to it, your body goes into a form of anaphylactic shock. And in most cases, you don't make it. Northwestern delivers 12,000 babies a year. They've been in existence at that time for over 30 years. They had 10 in their entire history. 6 did not make it, and the other 3 are in permanent vegetative states. The only reason I am put together the way I am today is because they thought fast. They were in the right mindset and they were prepared, but they will tell you that I prepared them. So the first phase of an amniotic fluid embolism is your lungs shut down, you have you go into cardiac arrest. And so they resuscitate me and they take my eyes shut. And then the second phase starts, which is DIC, your body's inability to clot blood. Your normal body has about 20 units of blood, and I was given 60 units of blood and blood product. And then they stabilize the bleed and they move me to the SICU. And my husband arrives and he has a consultation with the anesthesia. And this is where his pilot's, background worked really well for him because anesthesiologists and pilots work very similarly. So the anesthesiologist was like, this is what happened. Do yourself a favor. Do not look it up. Which obviously is not it's not possible. My husband went into action and said, what's morbidity, mortality? Where does she need to go in the next hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, what have you? And by the way, if she needs a hysterectomy, this is the doctor we met with 2 months before. And the anesthesiologist on the case took the note and was surprised that I had met with a gynecological oncologist. But she took the name and she said, we think we stabilized the bleed. Jonathan comes to me and sees me in the SICU, and I'm on life support. And I've asked him this question a million times, and he still says that he was like, I just dealt with the situation. I was like, you never thought about the fact that I said this was going to happen? And he's like, no, I just focused on the fact that I needed to get you better. So part of it, I believe, because I think you compartmentalize it, but then part of it is, you're in denial because there was something else going on, right? So he's with me, and 7 hours later, the bells and whistles go off in the ICU, and they realize I'm still bleeding. They call in the gynoc to perform the hysterectomy. They do the pathology on the uterus, and they see that an accreta had started to form, but the MRI didn't pick it up. So that was 6 for 6. And he was like, Jonathan's like, okay, so you guessed right 6 times. So then I said to him, he's like, but I was right too. I said you were going to survive, and I'm like, okay, I'll give you a gold star on that one. So then, so we go through the procedures. I go back into SICU. I'm in on medically induced coma. My kidneys fail. I'm in pretty bad shape. If I can I share my screen? Oh, I guess I can.
Yeah, you should be able to.
Okay, so I will show you. Let's see this one. See that?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Okay. Now we see you.
So I was there for about 6 days. They couldn't determine how much of neurological deficit. They didn't know what would happen. And then they, uh, brought me down off of the meds, and I'm still swollen like that. And I looked down once they extubated me, and I'm like, am I still pregnant? And so my husband was like, she's gonna be okay. But at the time, you're in a teaching hospital, and every department was around me and on me and in me, because I was the highest acuity case in the maternity ward at that time. And so um, they had they had the M&Ms after me. They were doing a bunch of stuff with this particular case, and they kept saying, how did you know? And I said, I don't know. I'm in a teaching hospital. You tell me. He said, well, with an embolus or with a heart attack, there's some foreboding, but moments before, maybe a day or two before, but months before, to know exactly what was going to happen. No, I don't have an explanation for that. And my one doctor who is on the board at Northwestern said, I think you need to go spiritual on this one. Don't have a medical explanation. And so in recovery, which was probably the hardest part, I mean, I went home in a wheelchair. I had 3 children to care for. I had a husband who was grateful that we dodged a bullet. And, I learned through therapist after therapist, because I was concerned that what if I have a premonition about a heart attack, or I have a vision, am I going to spontaneously combust? And now, as many of you know, which I didn't know at the time, is that when you go asystolic and then you get plugged back in, you're on high voltage. So now I'm feeling things that of other people from an empathic way, that I'm like, this doesn't matter. I'm feeling this person's pain. I'm feeling this person's heart pain. I couldn't discern between my pain or theirs. And I was scared for people to come around me. I was scared to mother. I was scared to life was forever changed. And so I went to one therapist, and Jonathan's like, well, we dodged a bullet. The therapist says, oh no, you didn't dodge the bullet. The bullet hit you dead on. You survived the bullet. And that changed my perspective on things, because I had to acknowledge that, no, I was clinically dead. I can't, if they didn't have those measures there, we wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. And by the way, if I didn't speak up when you guys were pushing me in one direction, I wouldn't be here talking. So I was angry. I was confused. I needed to be back to being a mother and a wife as quickly as I could. I wanted things to go back the way they were, but they could never go back the way they were, because my DNA had changed. So at some point, I talked about our story in the news, and my background, just so you know, is in television. I used to produce a lot of reality shows and game shows, and shows that are like Deal or No Deal and Extreme Makeover Home Edition, and worked for the networks and development, and didn't work on those particular shows, but I ran a company for Endemol and did the US Hispanic version of those. And so I'm good with high stress, high pressure. I'm not a neurotic, histrionic person. I'm very grounded in my reality. And this was a lot, and it was way too much for my husband to deal with. So he was just happy that our family was intact. And I was like, well, what about all of what happened prior? And he's like, can we just forget about that right now? We'll just like wipe it on the rug. I said, yeah, I can't. We can't do that. So I found, so I was on a talk show, and the host said to me, did you see the light? I said, I don't know, man, they gave me a lot of drugs. I have no idea, and I said, I wasn't concerned about not seeing a light or seeing a light, but if there was a way to find out, I wanted to find out. So I ended up going to regression therapy, and regression therapy uses hypnotherapy to take you back into the moments of trauma. And so what they talk about is that it's like a film strip that's stored in your brain. And because of the hypnosis, you can access those thoughts. But, they might be real, they might not be, but I was willing to try it. And if you can't figure it out by now, I'm totally type A. And so I videotaped my therapy because I don't want anyone tampering with my brain. I already knew where my baseline was before going in. And I'm like, what if this person messes with my head and I'm quacking like a duck, when somebody says hello. So I recorded these sessions, and at one point she got me back into the OR. And basically the angle was, I was the observer going back into the OR. I saw my body laying flat, and I saw everything happening in real time, accessing this moment. And then I saw my spirit perpendicular to the body. And at the moment of flatline, I saw the spirit shoot up like a shooting star. But when I say that I did not see that light, if I were the eyes of spirit, maybe I would have, but that's not what I saw. So I saw who hit the button for the code, which nurse jumped on my chest to give me CPR, where my doctors were down by my feet, the anesthesiologist down by my feet, my own OB did not deliver the baby. I saw that my doctor kept saying, this can't be happening, this can't be happening. I saw what was going on down the hall. I saw, where the nurse's break station was on the labor and delivery floor. I saw what my daughter was doing during the time of delivery. What my husband was wearing off the plane. So it was almost like the walls, everything just kind of disappeared. The ceilings disappeared. And then I saw spirits. I saw hundreds and hundreds of spirits. And I saw people I knew. And then I saw people I didn't know. And then I saw people I knew of, never had met, like my husband's father, who passed away in 1998, and my best friend's son, who died when he was 7 years old. And I've read enough psychology today to tell me, of course, when you're traumatized, you're going to see your loved ones, but it's all your brain, it's hypoxia, it's all these things. You're stressed, and of course you want your loved ones. I said, okay, I'll put a pin in that one. But it's the ones I didn't know that had messages that I gave back that ended up being right. So was that a good guess? Like you tell me. And they don't have an answer. So they give me a big question mark. I said, well, before you throw out an all-inclusive, theory, I would like you to just either leave room that your theory might be wrong, or stick to your convictions, and I will poke holes in it. So the video is quite graphic. I have it if you care to see like just a moment of it. But in that moment of the video, you see my body convulse and then, say all the things that I just told you. So, when I was done with that session, I felt better. Like it was just a relief, like just like an air bubble, like just has burst. And I was like, okay, I was holding all that in. And so my husband looks at the tape, and you can't watch it for more than 5 seconds. And he's like, how do you know this isn't a recalled episode of Grey's Anatomy in your head? I said, it's a fair point, after I was done calling him a lot of names. And so I said, okay. So I called the therapist and I said, how do you know what I'm telling you is true? And she says, sometimes the only validation we get is that the patient feels better and you feel better. I said, that's not good enough for me. I have witnesses. So luckily I had it on videotape. It wasn't like hearsay. It wasn't like, oh, I'm looking at the doctor's voices or body language and kind of edging my way in. I gave them the tapes. And my husband's like, I want to be there when they review those tapes. I said, perfect. I have no problem with this. I said, the majority of the reason why I'm doing this is because I need to prove to my husband that the afterlife exists. Because if I don't prove to him that the afterlife exists, then you telling me that our love, my soulmate love that I have, is over with when I die, because you're not going to pay attention to the fact that I'm standing there. And, he's like, I'm kind of agnostic about it. And I said, well, that's really crappy, because I see something different. I can't force a square peg into a round hole, but I can sure as hell try. So I take the tapes, I go back to the doctors, they look at the tapes and they're like, I didn't go to medical school for this. This is accurate down to where we were standing, what we were doing. And they're like, okay, so when the brain's shutting down, hearing might be the last to go. but you most certainly couldn't see. Your eyes were taped shut at one point. You had a curtain in front of your face. You wouldn't know where we were standing. You know, for 15 minutes before we delivered Jacob, you were catatonic. And I do remember, I didn't realize that it was like 15 minutes before they actually did the delivery, because apparently, you know, they were asking me questions and I was completely out of it. I think personally, I scared myself to death. Like, I scared myself out of my body. You're about to see the train hit you. Who wants to watch it? So either I stuffed myself down so far to be like, I'm bracing for impact, that nothing else. It was just like a closed funnel. Like, everything was just closing in and just became very quiet. So I said to my OB, I said, did you say this can't be happening? This can't be happening. She said, Stephanie, I was by your feet and I was in my mask. And I was like, this can't be happening. This can't be happening. She's like, you should most certainly couldn't hear that. I said, you didn't deliver the baby. And she's like, and Jonathan's like, she did deliver the baby. She had blood all over her scrub. I said she was there. I said, but she didn't deliver the baby. And he said, well, who did? I said, do you remember the gyn-onc resident, you know, that we had the consultation with and the resident was taking the notes? She delivered the baby. And he's like arguing with me in front of the OB. And he's like, why would she deliver it? She was on gyn-onc rotation. And so my doctor says, well, actually, we're in a teaching hospital. So when residents are in the back hallways, we offer them to come in and help out with the procedure. So she was back there about 15 minutes before we delivered you. And yeah, she delivered the baby. So that was all the evidence Jonathan needed, because he was like, obviously I couldn't have known it. That's not in my records. That's not anywhere in my files. I said, did the first crash cart work, but the first crash cart not work, but the second crash cart did? And one of the doctors was like, I don't remember that. And you think I remember that, but we were all quite traumatized, or not as traumatized as you, but we were all quite traumatized. And I said, so they went back to check it out. And sure enough, there was a second crash cart that was brought in. The best part I'd say about my story, as you know, of course, the survival, and of course, my baby is fine and our family is intact. But the best thing that's happened is I get asked a ton to speak at hospitals and medical institutions. And I spoke at the Department of Defense, and the doctors are listening differently that I speak to, and they're practicing medicine differently. And so if it takes one story to alert them as to, you know, even in the simplistic way of talking, like tests aren't everything, data isn't everything. Sometimes the patient just knows, and maybe that should be taken into consideration, because the first thing you learn in medical school is the patient is already giving you the diagnosis. So why wouldn't you listen more intently, especially knowing who I am as a patient, knowing that this wasn't my usual DNA, and I'm telling you this is going to happen. Said you weren't using your own intuitive self in your own way without the data to realize that something else was going on. And that's all I can ask. I can ask, you know, patients to speak up, because at the end of the day, you'll never regret speaking up and being wrong. Okay, people judge you. Everybody thought I was crazy. I would have sent flowers and chocolates and said, you know, I will never have another baby again. Thank you very much. But on the chance that you're right, it's not worth staying quiet if it's going to save your life. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, Stephanie, a couple of things just in your telling there. You said at one point my DNA had changed. Can you go into that a little more? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean it metaphorically, and I also mean it literally. So when one goes through what I've learned about like C. diff or anything else, when your body like hemorrhages and it just resets the gut biome, your DNA can actually change and shift. So when you're given 60 units of blood and blood product, that's 60 units of living tissue and living energy, right? Your red blood cells don't recycle for another 90 days. So if they don't recycle, I was a different person. Like everybody was like, you were so different. I said, well, maybe that's the anesthesia. And maybe, you know, well, yeah, I'm traumatized. It's PTSD. I'm like, you know, so I'm going through all of this stuff, but I'm making an excuse. But at the end of the day, when looking back at it, I had other people's energy inside of me. And by the time that part wore off, then my new reality set in. So what I had in my DNA prior to this happening, so DNA is made up of environment, right? Your natural DNA, your XY chromosomes, but then it gets adjusted through environment or through traumas or through experiences. And so having an Armageddon on your body, both in your psyche and your physiology, and then you come out the other side of it, everybody else, yes, they've been second victims of the trauma, but they didn't physically go through it. Energetically, spiritually, they did. But now I have to readjust in a world that was okay for me prior. And now all of a sudden I feel like a fish out of water. Like now all of a sudden I am needing to be more introverted, which I wasn't. Now I'm needing to not get so close to people because I'm feeling their pain. And it was something that was not comfortable. And my premonitions didn't stop. So, getting plugged back in, all of a sudden I was seeing life and death situations of other people and their health, and it would come out because I had no filter. So I was just explaining things in those moments and I was tripping over myself. And there were moments that, there was this woman on Instagram that posted about my book, and all she did was say, this book changed my life. And I was like, oh my God, like I had a visceral reaction to the book. It was a post of my book and her hand. And I sent her a direct message and I said, thank you for taking me on vacation with you. And she's like, I just had a miscarriage and this really affected me. And I said, oh my, and it came in like almost an out of body experience. And I don't know if any of you have felt that when I look at the group I'm talking to. Of course, you guys have experienced these things. So I start typing. I said, I am so sorry about your loss, but it's preparing you for what you're about to experience. And she's like, what do you mean? I said, you're about to be involved with a catastrophic childbirth. This person took my book home. Like she wasn't asking to have any kind of connection, right? And I'm like, and she's like, well, I'm a doula. I'm like, oh my God, that's why those words, because I had to read back because I don't remember any of it. I said, she's like, what do you mean? I've been a doula for 10 years and nothing catastrophic has happened. And I said, it's coming. And rightfully so, she disconnects, blocks me and everything else. And, I'm like, I'm telling my husband, he's like, you cannot do that. People are taking whatever you're saying in this regard very seriously. I said, I know I need to shut the door. Don't let me near a computer. Don't let me, I'm so sorry. I tried to apologize. I'm like, ignore me, whatever. 3 weeks goes by and I get an emergency text from her on Instagram that says, I wasn't ignoring you. I have 6 children and, whatever. But we have a doula in our group who delivered her niece's 8th child. And she had an amniotic fluid embolism and she died on the operating table. And because I had read your book and because we had had that conversation, we were able to figure out ways to get in touch with the AFE Foundation and work through, because we're in the healthcare world, about figuring out how to get samples and what have you. So I don't know how it comes. I don't ask the question, why me? What I do ask all the time, and what you saw in the Netflix series, was I want to know how it works. I want to know the mechanics of it. I want to know my timing. I want to know when I feel this, it means I have 5 minutes to do this. And I also want to know, like, even if I insert myself into the narrative or they insert themselves into their own narrative, the outcome could still be the same. Maybe it was just to prepare them for what was to come. And maybe it's not my job to alert it. And maybe it's not my job to insert myself. So that's been the change of DNA.
It brings up the question, this premonition that you had you had premonitions before that?
Not like that. I mean, when I was a kid at 10, I was across the country, and my grandmother, who's from Cuba, my grandmother I was very close to my grandmother. She was santera. So she was, which means like she was very witchy in her ways, but believer in ESP. My father never believed in any of this stuff. And from 3,000 miles away, I felt my chest hurt. And I looked at my father. I said, have you spoken to grandma? And he's like, no, but I'll call her tomorrow. And that was the moment she had a fatal heart attack. I had, at 19, I think he was. So I was 19 at the time, and I hugged my uncle, and it was between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And I hugged my uncle, and he was a healthy man, running, hours a day. And I just had this overwhelming sadness because I knew it would be the last time I saw him, and he died 2 days later. So when you are young, you think you're willing it to happen. And so you shut it down until it was my own foreboding, and then it ignited something else.
So there was a pattern of these things that, and you said you probably shut it down and were able to ignore these kinds of forebodings or sixth sense experiences, but they perhaps were going on all along.
They might have, but most certainly I put blinders on at that point, for sure.
Another thing that strikes me is that when you had this foreboding, a lot of people, I don't know that everybody would have been as bold as you were and as straightforward about just telling everyone I'm going to die, insisting against, doctors and your husband and everyone that you knew something that they couldn't know or didn't know, and that it should be. I mean, do you know what gave you that conviction?
I think that that's part of my DNA, but I think that I didn't worry about judgment, and that's what kind of pushed me through. It was a knowing, like I said, when you know something, you don't know how you know, you just do. I wasn't questioning where it was coming from. It was a solid knowing. I look at, I define what premonitions feel like and what a casual thought is. So to give you an example, if you're sitting on an airplane and you're thinking, planes crash, this plane could crash. Oh my God, this plane's going to crash. That is a fleeting casual thought. That is more anxiety in that moment. But if you're preparing for this flight and it's weeks away, and you have the hair on the back of your neck stand up thinking, I don't know why I shouldn't be taking this flight. It might not be because the flight's going to crash, but you might be needed exactly where you are at the time. And if you can, I would change the flight, because a premonition is incessant. It does not let up. It is a daily reminder that this is there. It is constantly buzzing in your body, in your head, in the back of your neck. And every one of us has experienced some form of it or another, whether it's about a person, whether it's about a business decision, and whether it's about your health. There's something that's gnawing on you saying this doesn't feel right. And there's nothing worse than not being heard. So in the sense of like the convictions I had, I was screaming on the rooftops. I mean, I have the love of my life. He's listening to me to a certain extent, right? Because he's going with me to every appointment, but this is out of his toolbox that he knows what to use. None of it adds up. So I can't, on the Netflix thing, people have emailed me all over saying, don't be mad at your husband. It's really sad. I mean, he did the best he could. How's your marriage going? I'm like, listen, first of all, that was shot like 1.5 years ago. Second, we're good. We talked about it. He's like, I feel like you threw me under the bus. I said, I didn't throw you under the bus. I said, you finally said out loud something. Because in the book, we texted each other because he couldn't bring himself to say the words that he believed me. So it was more of a text. In the Netflix thing, he caught me off guard because he said, I believe that she can see these things. I don't know how, but it begs the question that maybe we are not alone, or I don't remember exactly what he said. And I broke down crying because it was the first time that he articulated it the way that he did. And then Ricky, the director, rightfully so, as a good director, asked, Stephanie, why are you crying? And I'm like, well, because I wish he would have said that when I was going through it. And he's like, that's the part I'm talking about that you threw me under the bus. I said, well, I just explained my feelings in the moment. And he's like, yeah, well, you could have done a better job. And I was like, I hear you, I understand. So yeah.
When we talked earlier, you said that it's only recently that you've been able to speak with conviction
Yeah.
about this. And that's kind of set you on a new course, I think.
Yeah.
But can you describe that transition to being able to speak with conviction?
Yeah, it wasn't easy. I mean, when the book first came out, in 2015, I led with data. I led with the veridical experience. I mean, even when I came to IANDS and I spoke with Jan on her panel, I led with data. That was my comfort. I had gone through so many hoops to prove what I had said was going to happen, that was great. I didn't have to get emotional about it. It was what it was. And every time we got close enough to the moment of what did I see in those moments, or do you believe in life after death? It was a very personal spiritual journey. And I was not prepared to have that conversation. I was still in therapy. I was talking with my rabbi, I was talking with family, but anytime somebody said, well, prophets were seers in the Bible, I would start crying. Anytime somebody would put my name and God has a reason, all this, I would start crying. And so I wanted to compartmentalize all of that because I needed to process what that meant. And I have faith and I believe in God. And I do believe that I was helped from the other side, but I had a hard time articulating that. And I also knew that is not my husband's comfort level, and this is my soulmate. So if I'm going to articulate something and go way out there, of which I believe, I didn't want to go so way out there where I'm losing that connection, and wrongfully thought, because he was like, honey, this is your truth. You have to live your truth. Whether I believe it or not is irrelevant. He's like, I believe you. And so that is not going to change. And so that gave me permission to explore a little deeper, because I would get these premonitions and I would see spirits. And, I was talking with Laura Lynn Jackson and she was like, you have these mediumship abilities. I said, no, I don't. If I'm anything, I'm intuitive, and I'd be denying it, but I do see things. And I'm like, no, let me just put a pin in that and I'll come back to it. But I do not. And like I told you earlier, I do not believe that's my calling in life. I believe other people do that well. I believe other people can call up to spirit, call into spirit, can see things immediately. They've worked on their craft. They listen. I tried to shut it all out. And that is not it. I already have 3 children and a husband, and then recovering and dealing with all of these newfound, if you call them gifts. In the beginning, they weren't so much. And so I didn't need to add spirits to that. I didn't need to add ghosts who were coming into my house. So I would be like, so one medium said, just tell them to leave. So that's what I did every day. I was like, you're not welcome. You can't. And I don't know whether that it worked, but I don't know whether that was right or wrong. I just would say it. And then all of a sudden the noise would stop. And, the kids would be like, hey, I saw my dad died almost 2 years ago. And my daughter just told me, oh, he visits me and he sits on the edge of the bed. And I felt him touch my toe. I said, yeah, he wasn't invited in. I didn't tell him to come in. I'm like, Dad, you need to, you're freaking me out, so, it's acknowledging it, and also acknowledging that it's a safe place to be, whether somebody believes it or not. It took me a long time to get to this point where I could say, this is my truth. And I can't make you believe or not. So I think I led with the veridical stuff because that is easy to prove and disprove, right? You could just, here's the data, here are the doctors, here's the testimony. Great. Okay. No question this happened. Okay, fantastic. I don't need to go into any kind of conversations about what happens after we die. But when you add everything together and you have the tapes of the doctors and what I saw in post-coma, that consciousness definitely exists after the brain shuts down, or when one is in a coma, they can actually see, not just hear. That is not information I should be keeping to myself. So it just took a long time to get comfortable with stepping out on that ledge.
That clears that up a little bit.
Yeah.
As well, in your therapy, you talked about the hypnosis. You did some past life regression work, didn't you?
Yes, but she was like, "Do you want to know what you were in a past life?" And I said, "I can't prove it. So what's the point? I mean, unless you're going to tell me that I spoke a different language and then I can prove that, that's fine. But if you're going to tell me I'm a Viking princess, how do I prove that?" So I was less interested in that, other than knowing past life, meaning what happened in 37 seconds and what happened in the subsequent coma. And maybe if I had optics into what was happening around those 3 months, that I could feel those things, I wanted to be able to see it from an observer's point of view, if it was available to me.
And did you turn anything up in that work of interest?
In past life, or what happened during
in regression therapies?
Yeah, well, she said that I definitely knew my husband in a past life because we're so connected that, I mean, when we met, we married 6 months later, and it was just a very soulful connection. And I joke all the time, they're like, "Oh, well, if your husband ever cheated on you, you're so strong, you'd leave him." I said, "A naked woman could fall out of the sky and land on my husband's lap. I'm not leaving." I said, I'm going to have a conversation with him about, like, why is there a naked woman in your lap? But what did I do to contribute to the naked woman falling in your lap? Right. And so he's like, I'm married the best wife. But did I come up? So during the 37 seconds, I saw, that I was a couple of steps down from this congregation of people. I did not see heaven. I mean, it was heavenly, but I didn't see any buildings. I didn't see I didn't see God. I don't know whether it's because there was a short time span or what have you, but I remember being 2 steps below and the curiosity being there. I also remember seeing my grandmother. I remember seeing my uncle, and him talking about, like, you've always been a fighter. You can fight this, you can go back. It was not comfortable for me to be there. It was nice to see family and other people I didn't know. But I most certainly didn't want to stay. I saw my husband's father, and he had a coin in his hand, and an ascot, and he was a foreign service officer. So I was noticing certain things, and it's interesting when people, and I'm starting to recognize that it's more telepathic communication, because I don't hear, I mean, I hear the message, but it's not articulated in words, if that makes sense. It's like, Jan's shaking her head, like, of course, because I've heard this before. But most of the time when I talk about this, the people that I'm talking to are like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So I see a moment, like, it'll flash. And I instantly know the connection to the person. So I have seen spirits before when I've done talks, and I instantly know that they lost their best friend or their aunt. I don't know names, but I feel like that was all part of this leftover when I got plugged back in. But in those 37 seconds, I saw Jonathan's father, and he had a message. And of course, I tell my husband, and he's like, I said, "I saw your father." And he said, "Tell him I said hi." And I said, "Okay, let's not be a schmuck." I'm like, this is what I saw. First of all, he was wearing a tweed jacket. It was like mustard color on certain, but like a beige color, had some green stripes in it, had some patches on the elbows. And he's like, "My father never had a tweed jacket." And I was like, "Okay, forget about the jacket." There was a coin, and I go into the details. It was a foreign coin. It wasn't silver or gold. It was a heavy metal, and it had these insignias on it. And I'm like it was oblong. It wasn't shaped circular, all these things. He's like, "I have no idea what you're talking about." Then I go, and I feel like I have to sleuth it. Like, I become a detective. Like, what do these messages mean? So I go from family member to family member. One family member says, "What is Jonathan talking about?" did the jacket have these green stripes? I said, yes. Like, that was his favorite jacket. So I go back to Jonathan. I'm like, what are you talking about? That's his favorite jacket. He's like, well, if you would have said herringbone. And I'm like, what is herringbone? They're like, it's the name of a stitch in a tweed jacket. I'm like, I hate you, because that is unacceptable, right? And so then I'm like, what about the coin? I'm going from person to person to person, right? And the coin. Finally, his younger brother says, Jonathan says, oh, well, she saw dad, and because he was asking how my regression was. And I said, I saw your father. And he's like, well, tell me about it. And she's like, well, he saw, I said, I had this coin, and he stops, and he's like, that's interesting. He's like, the other day, he says, I found one of dad's old suitcases, and I was going through it, and behind the zipper in the crevice of the suitcase was a coin. I said, can you describe that coin for me, please? And it was almost verbatim. And then immediately I knew the answer, because this was the son. The coin was from Croatia, and this was the son that was in London during the most unusual snowstorm London ever had. His father had a massive coronary at the time, and the ambulance couldn't get to him fast enough, and he died in front of his brother, in front of Jonathan's brother. And he had always felt guilty about the fact that he couldn't save his father's life. And the coin represents a time when it was one of their last trips, and it was a very pleasant memory. And he said he wanted him to focus on that, because there was nothing he could have done to save his life. And so, of course, my husband's like, that was a good party trick. And I'm like, yep, that was a good party trick. We're going to stick to that.
As we say in Texas, bless his heart.
Bless his heart. Yep, that's exactly.
Yeah, it's just really hard for him.
My husband was in Del Rio in the Air Force Base there. So he laughs, because I found a picture today I was going to post that, when he was in the Air Force, he said the services said 8 to 9 Catholic, 9 to 10 Protestant, Jewish, call. Yep.
Yes. Howdy. So, but that kind of touches on, I heard you talk in your ISCO talk a little bit about what I would describe as spontaneous or unsought mediumship abilities that have manifested since this experience.
Yeah. It's unfortunate. Yes, it's not pleasant. It's because I don't get, oh, this person is going to win the lottery. I get, this person it's a matter of life and death, and it's fight or flight. Or this person, and the same message has come up with people who have committed suicide, where people are like, well, Stephanie, if you ever see my son, or if you ever see my daughter, if you ever see my spouse, I'm like, intuitively, I'm like, I haven't. I said, and I think the reason that I haven't is because it's not my first sight to see. It's yours. You need to forgive. You need to come with less anger, and maybe the person will show up. But I said, this isn't mine for me to give you comfort. You need to give that soul comfort, and that soul needs to give you comfort when you're open to it. But I don't know how it works. I really want to know how it works. And Jonathan is, keeps reminding me the Sherlock Holmes quote. He's like, once you eliminate the impossible, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. So he's accepted the fact that I can see. He's accepted the fact that this is what my life is now. He feels that I'm going down a rabbit hole I will never get an answer to. And he's like, my brain is filled with too many things that I want to learn about, and this is not one of them. I said, yeah, because it's not happening in your body. I agree. I hear you. I understand. But I don't think I'll ever stop asking questions.
Well, and then along those lines, and I want to invite, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand, turn off your mic, and speak up. But I do have a couple more things I wanted to put in front of you. One is, I know you've started a podcast recently called Knowing, and I wanted to find out, tell us about the podcast, what you hope to do with it, and what you've done with it so far, how it's worked out.
Well, it hasn't yet. So it's we've shot the pilot. I'm actually working with Ricky from Netflix, and so she and I are executive producers of the pilot of the show. The Knowing podcast is about you don't know how you know, you just do. And there are more stories. Since this story had come out many years ago, I get emails constantly from people explaining their own experiences. And they just need to be validated and they need to be heard. And healing can begin when people are heard. And I think that in order to normalize the conversation, we need to share these stories. When I was going through what I was going through, I Google searched pregnancy, foreboding, issues, whatever, and it didn't exist. And now that my story is out there, people are reaching out to ask me questions about what to do in the medical situation, about how to talk to their doctors or how to talk to their clinicians about certain things. And I don't know why they're reaching out to a complete stranger. Ultimately, what I found is that the clinicians are not as receptive to hearing it. So they need to talk about it in a certain way to get them to hear it. And so the goal with the podcast is to share different stories with extreme stories that have had an unbelievable knowing where in many cases someone had lost a life, but they knew it was going to happen before it happened. And by sharing it, the goal is that people take these knowings very seriously, and maybe in some cases it can save a life.
Yeah. By the way, I appreciate the definition that you gave us earlier of a knowing versus a casual thought. I'd never heard that articulated that way, and that's a nice little nugget. And then also now I haven't seen the Netflix series. There, as I understand, Jan, there are 6 episodes in that.
Yeah, I think there's 5 or 6. Yeah. Mhm.
And then what was your part of that?
We were part of episode 1. We were after Dr. Mary C. Neal. And so Mary's story was the first 30 minutes, and then we were the next 15 after that.
Okay. Good.
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, that kind of exhausts my list of questions. So
I have some. First of all, I relate to your explanation of the feeling of a premonition, and I've had that experience as well. And one of the ones that I usually tell my students about, because it's clear and concise. I was sitting at my office at the university working at the computer one afternoon. And as I was doing this work, suddenly this knowing washed into me and through me that my husband was going to be in a bad accident and he was going to be okay, like serious accident, and he was going to be okay. So when I have experiences like this, I stop what I'm doing. I close my eyes, focus inward to see if there's like anything else to come with it. And in this case, there wasn't. That was it. And after maybe 40 seconds or so, it faded and it was gone, but the memory was very clear. I didn't know when this accident was going to happen. I didn't know what the exact nature of it was, but none of that was really important, because the meaning that you've put on it, and it's interesting, a little side note, interesting to me that developmentally you talked about how as a child you thought you caused these things. Mm-hmm. Now your interpretation is that somehow you're being like prepared or sort of forewarned. Mm-hmm. And that fits developmentally, just the way logic works for children. They think they're egocentric. They think if they know something that they caused it, and then you get older and you get a bigger picture and realize it's just a warning. So that evening, I was shopping for a coat. I was going to be going out of town and needed a new coat the next day, and pulled into a parking space at the mall, and my cell phone rang, and it was my husband's number. So I thought, that's odd, because he was on one of his Wednesday night bike rides, which he'd been going on for every Wednesday night since we'd been together, which at that point was a few years. And he was in the middle of the ride, and he never would call me in the middle of a ride. So I answer the phone, and there's a Hispanic man on the other end of the line. He says his name is, Jorge or something, I don't know what, and that he's a technician at the emergency room at Baylor. And before he said anything else, I knew, what the gist of what he was going to say. And he said, your husband's been in a very bad accident. He was actually unconscious for 5 minutes, but he seems to be okay now. He seems, for a while he was kind of regaining his orientation, but now he seems pretty much back. And so of course, I never even went into the mall. I just pulled out and drove to Baylor and, went to be with him. But it definitely, the premonition itself, it's an embodied knowing. It's not like a thought or an idea that I know that I created out of, as you say, like anxiety or just imagination or something like that. It's this thing that washes into and through me, and is as you say, it's not as if there are words. It's just the knowing comes whole, without language. And of course, I can put language to it, but it itself doesn't have language. Now, one of the things that's for me, well, I shouldn't say that, because I've had mediumship experiences about information with other people as well. But some of my premonitions are of positive things. And a lot of my premonitions come, I'm waking up in the morning, and as I'm coming into consciousness, there's a phrase of a song in my mind. And it's not a song I've heard recently or anything like that. But again, it has this quality about it that I know that it's telling me something that's about to happen. And I can do things like I can say, is this my personal life or my professional life? Okay, this is about my professional life. And so an example is, one morning I woke up and there's the phrase, to have a girl like her would truly be a dream come true. Do you know this song? Out of all the girls in the world, it was just my imagination. Well, I didn't get any of that stuff. It was just this phrase.
Right.
To have a girl like her would truly be a dream come true. And so I'm like, personal, professional. Okay, this is professional. It's like somebody is gonna like communicate that idea to me, that to have a girl like you would truly be a dream come true in some kind of professional context. And I'm like, okay, whatever. Well, woke up the next morning, it's there. The next morning, it's there. The third morning, it's there. And that day, the third day, I receive an email from the Dujam Buddhist Association in Hong Kong, with whom I'd never communicated before, asking me to come over for an all expenses paid trip to do a presentation for a conference for them. Now, if you know anything about the, Buddhist and Eastern people, they're like, oh, revered Dr. Holden, it would be so wonderful if you would grace us with your presence, and it's like, to have a girl like you,
Right.
truly be a dream come true. So I really pay attention to those. And sometimes they're about distressing things, but sometimes they're about, exceptionally positive things. And again, I appreciate them because they are warnings, and I can prepare, I can be like not so knocked off my feet by something unusual happening. So,
yeah. And that's one of my friends had said, when like a year later, I was like, weren't you surprised? She's like, no, because you prepared me.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, exactly. It's a gift. Even with bad news, it's a gift to be prepared for the bad news rather than be, so traumatized by it. So yeah. Yeah. So I just really related to what you were saying. And I noticed you keep asking, how does it work? How does it work?
Hmm.
The only thing that I can say about how it works is, well, because I also, as a counselor, do a technique called induced after death communication, which Pete knows about. And we know in that work that in order for the person, the client, to have an experience of after death communication, they need to be in a certain kind of psychological, psychospiritual space. And they can't be grasping. They need to be in this kind of centered, open, inviting, but not demanding or grasping or anything kind of place. And it's in that kind of more neutral place that the material comes to them. And so what I know about how it works is that it has something to do with our kind of mental frame. And a lot of times people will say that the premonitions come to them when they're just kind of relaxed and not really, thinking about anything particular. So you're in a kind of an alpha brainwave state, and that's when we're most receptive. So I don't know if any of that resonates for you, but those are my thoughts about how it works.
Yeah, I think sometimes you get forced down that hole. It's like, you just get plugged back in and then you don't know how to control it. You're kind of flying with all this frenetic energy. And that was
absolutely. Yes. And it's such a common thing that after an NDE, it's like, in the words of Aldous Huxley, the doors of perception are blown open. And there, as you say, there's no filter. The stuff is coming at you, and it's a skill set to learn how to moderate that, and how to say no or set limits, and then the whole thing about the dilemma about what you do with information. Sometimes it's like, do I really want to tell the person this? And yeah. So there's a lot to that whole process. Yeah.
Our AFE research is done at Baylor. So we have our foundation is all of the research, all of our samples, everything is done at Baylor. So it's interesting.
Yeah, interesting connection. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
do you have an idea that there is any purpose to the knowing, to the sixth sense experiences?
Yeah,
or are they random?
No, I think well, first of all, I know that we all have it. It's just some are more perceptive than others, but it's there as your compass. I tell people, I'm like, I don't care if you want to believe it comes from a spiritual place or a scientific place. I just want you to trust it, because 9 times out of 10, what you feel in your gut, if your gut reaction is right, whether it's about a person or somebody you wanted to date, and you're like, okay, well, this person doesn't feel right, but I'm going to do it anyway, and the relationship implodes, then you'd be like, I knew it. Or a business deal you wanted to do, and you're like, something just doesn't seem right about it, but you know what, you needed to work through the money and you needed to make it happen, and then that implodes, and you're like, I knew that too. And so I just don't think people should take chances when they have gut feelings dealing with their health. That could cost them their life. Money will come and go, relationships will come and go, but your life is your life. So yes, we have this knowing. It is a compass. It will tell you what will go very right or very wrong in your life. And I just want people to take it more seriously. We talk about data, like I'm preparing a talk, and, they're very data driven in this talk. And I said, you know what, my accreta didn't show, I had a false negative on my MRI, but nobody talks about the margin of error in the data. And doctors lean heavily on data and AI, right? They lean heavily on the information, and they make their diagnostics based on this data. And they also take history, right? But if the history starts to change because the person's perception or concerns are saying there's something else wrong, all I'm asking you to do is not only listen to the patient already giving you the diagnosis, which is what you learn the first year of medical school. But I'm also saying, you're not being honest with me, saying there is a margin of error, like close to 18% on MRIs. So with that being said, you want to go science? Let's go science, right? You're telling me that the likelihood of that happening is not going to happen. Well, because I feel it. Well, the likelihood that MRI could go wrong is a lot higher than me being wrong. So, yeah.
And if I could say too, and I don't know how much, I'm interested to know how much you resonate with this idea. It seems implicit in what you're saying, Stephanie, that the purpose of this knowing, the premonition capability, is essentially protection. It's to protect us and promote our well-being.
Mhm.
Now, I don't know if that's always the case, but I certainly know that that can be a good guiding principle about how to use the information. And part of what you're saying is, there's this source that is trying to give you information to protect you, to promote your well-being. And because Western culture is so logical,
Mhm.
and this is trans-rational, it comes, beyond reason. But to listen to it, and to know that you have choice around how you're going to use the information. Because I certainly can resonate with that too. There was a moment in my life when I knew that if I made a particular decision, my life was going to take a particular trajectory that wasn't going to be all that good. And I knew that, and I chose it anyway.
Mhm.
And that was my choice, but I had the information. Yeah.
Agreed. And so that's what I'm saying. I mean, it's animals have instinct, mothers have instinct. It's, I would call that a knowing. The San in Africa, the First Nation, will look at giraffes for danger because they see things from far away that they can't feel yet. So they will look at where their necks are pointed, where they're running away from, and they know exactly where the danger is coming from. So they're watching that animal instinct because it happens before they would get their personal instinct. So it's like the tentacles are up and we just don't pay attention to it enough because it's not logical, as you said.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's also preventive. I think a knowing helps you prevent
Mhm.
things that are going to happen.
Mhm.
And it makes you aware as well.
Yeah.
And sometimes you might not be able to prevent it, right?
Right.
It's just preparing you for it. I spoke to somebody who had this knowing in a dream that her cousin was going to be shot and killed in a truck. And so she woke up very startled from that dream, and it just felt so real that she called him and she's like, you need to stay away from a truck. You need to stay away from whatever. And he's like, what are you, psychic? And she's like, it hit me so hard. And, it had happened a few times. And so she let him know. About a year later, he had a new pickup truck and he went to his ex-girlfriend's house to pick up his stuff, and she shot him dead with a shotgun. And, she said to me, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm like, how are you feeling and everything? And she's like, Stephanie, I realized because he was like a brother to me, that this was preparing me for what was to come. So this premonition that I had, this knowing that I had, was not for him. It was for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that perspective was very interesting because I interviewed also just recently for the podcast a young man who he and his wife had the same kind of dream that she wasn't going to make it through delivery. And they were startled by it, and they did some things to talk about it and fronted it. And her mother worked in the hospital and everything like that. And she ultimately lost her life. And, there's a whole other part of this case, but there's this sadness that sits inside of you. Like, we knew this was going to happen. What could we have done to change it? And I don't know whether they could have done anything to change it. She spoke up, he spoke up, and the outcome was still the same. And that that is something I wrestle with, because even the first guy I interviewed for our pilot episode was, he had seen things in war that he had known which soldiers were not going to come back that day. Like, he had known. And he's like, it wasn't brave of me to know. It was brave of them to go out and fight. And I said, I beg to differ with you. I said, because the reality is they're going out thinking today's going to be my lucky day. I'm going to go out. I can't see beyond my one foot in front of the other. And the fact that, that's got to weigh heavy on your soul, even though it's not happening to you, you're watching it happen in front of you.
And one phenomenon that occurs with some near-death experiencers is that they see the future of the planet, the future of humanity. And there's a theme of that humanity is going to go through a really rough time over the next few decades. And there's nothing to be done about that, except for people to know that there's a real possibility that tough times are coming. And, if we can avert them, great, but not likely to happen. Yeah. So, it isn't always something we can do something about. Fortunately, in your case, you were able to do things that really averted disaster. And there are some cases where people do take the advice not to get on the plane, and then that plane crashes, and that sort of thing. But sometimes it's really more just to prepare us. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You mentioned gifts as if, we've talked about the mediumship, and it's kind of an eye-rolling definition of what that is for you, but any others?
I think the empathic side of me feeling things from people, it's, I don't have a lot of friends anymore, because if people don't want to be seen, they definitely don't want to come in front of me. But I don't think that that's the reason. I just think that because I'm not somebody who will front any part of their inner stuff. It's just, I have a very close circle of friends, and it's hard to have that kind of exposure. But no, I feel things off of people. I feel pain off of people in different parts. Like, if somebody is sexually assaulted or abused, like, I feel it buzzing in my body. And then the very nature of who I am, I want to help. And I just, how do you tell a complete stranger, like, I'm like, and I have to have a boundary, and that's hard. So so I don't know whether that's a gift. I don't know whether, my teenage daughter would say that it is not a gift that I can predict what she's going to do when she's trying to get away with something. And so she's like, Mom, I just need boundaries. And I said, I don't, what do you mean? And so, of course, my husband's like, honey, she needs to have a normal teenage life. Like, she needs to be able to lie, and she needs to be able to go out with friends and you not calling what she's doing. And I said, well, you're asking me to change who I am. And he's like, they're both like, no, we're just asking you to look away. And I'm like, okay. Okay, fine. You know what? You're going to be responsible for her social life, but if something happens, then you're going to own it. Right. And so she's tried several times. She's just like, okay, so I'm going to go out with these friends. I said, I don't want to know, because if I know, then I know, and I don't want to know. And so I'm trying to have boundaries. So help me have boundaries. So it's tricky, of course, she's like, why can't you just be normal? I'm like, okay, working on it.
So it does present some challenges in your family around issues of privacy and agency and all those sorts of things. Yeah. It's like is it a gift or is it a curse?
Well, my teen would say it's a curse, but you know, she does. So there are moments when she will invite somebody where she's like, they're a little scared of you. And I was like, they should be, you know, but if they're coming over here, then they're totally fine. Right. So they should be scared of your father. Your father's just like unemotional and very stringent Air Force guy, shotgun, you know, and everything. And he's like, they're like, no, they're not really scared of dad. They're just like, you know, they're wondering what you're going to see. And I was like, so I think she brought like one boy over at one point, and then met him and walked away and everything. And then later she's like, what'd you think? And I'm like, yeah, it's not gonna last. And then she's like, what do you mean? And so I'm like, you know, this is what I see, this, and this. And she's like, you're wrong. And then 4 weeks later, I hate you. It's like, yeah, it's all good.
Well, this all falls under the category of integration, you know, the integrating the experience and its aftermath and its what it bestows into your life, you know, integrating that. And I've heard that, you know, I'm not an experiencer, but I've heard, and maybe Jan can speak to this, but this is it's sometimes a very long process of integrating these things, you know, what to do with them, how to live with them.
Yeah, I mean, also Lilia, I think you guys know Smolia, she explained to me, she said, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't get all of your download yet, like that there's more coming. And I'm like, I can't handle much more. And she's like, yeah, but I think that once things start settling down and you get the, you know, into the comfort, like I told you, like it's been an evolution of accepting and having more conviction. You know, I'm concerned about what that looks like for the next phase, like as you open up even more to it. But you know, yeah, integration is difficult, especially with 3 kids in school, and you want to have them have birthday parties or forget about the pandemic for a moment, but you know, going to school functions, going to try and be a mom in a PTA, or you know, that's impossible for me. You know, and John's like, you really need to try harder. And I'm like, I don't think you understand. I said, I go into a room of more than 10 people, I am overwhelmed. I said, I'm working on the protection, which I do, but you know, you're going to a school function. They want to get together. They want to have drinks. They want, you know, it's like it's constant. And so it's just figuring out the balance, but I'm not there yet.
Have you noticed any change in your sensitivity? Because it's been 7 years. Have you noticed any evolution or whatever of your sensitivity, or is it just the same as it was right after?
No, it's more controlled in the sense that I have, you know, again, I don't know how it works, but I've been given the advice to just speak to spirit guides, speak to God, speak to angels, speak to guardian angels, speak to whoever it is that only give you the information that you need. And so with that, I haven't been inundated, and I won't make excuses for it, because I don't know, but so I'm like, that frenetic energy has stopped, unless I go into something where I haven't actually meditated, protected myself, and then just kind of get, you know, the day-to-day just gets packed and you just forget. And so you walk into a room with a bunch of people and you're like, whoa, okay, I'm going to sit in the car. I'm going to wait. And I look like the crazy mom that just won't socialize with anyone. So, but it has definitely been less. And I feel like when I feel something, I'm actually more like, if it's not a life and death situation, when it comes to my family, then I am much calmer about how I relay the information. There is a softer landing, if you will. You know, there is less of a fight or flight to get that information. but
It's
yeah.
almost like you have a little more distance from it. You experience it, but initially you were immersed in it and reactive to it. And now you experience it and it's like you go, okay, there's that thing. Now what am I going to do with it? How am I going to, am I going to, if so, how am I going to? So you exercise a lot, you have a little distance and more sort of like control.
But there's also, the flip side of that is, yeah, I have more control on that. I feel it and I'm like, okay, that's great. But when it comes to somebody that's in front of me that something happens instantaneously and it's going to affect the agnostic or the skeptic who's in front of me, I find that it comes out very easily. And all of a sudden they're like, how do you know that? And so it gives them pause. And so usually like in those moments, I'm like, okay, well, you know what? I have to allow this to come through because that person is responsible for XYZ and they can change people's lives by knowing this information because it personally affected them. Right. I was lecturing at one of the schools and universities, and the faculty advisor of the medical school was like, Stephanie, I'm familiar with your story, but I'm not going to flag every neurotic, histrionic pregnant woman's file to prepare them for the operating room. And I said, that's not what I'm asking you to do. What I'm asking you to do is use your own intuition the same way that the patient's using theirs to help, ease their comfort and, listen to them. And meanwhile, there's a room full of residents and fellows and what have you. And so after the lecture, he was just walking away. I said, oh, Professor, I'm not done with you. And I said, just give me 1 minute. So a couple of residents came over and said, he's really tough. And I said, no, I got him, but go ahead. So the residents were like, I know exactly what you're talking about. My mother was intuitive. I listen to patients when I meet them. So even though they're teaching us about this, I also listen differently, and which was great to hear. And then I walked up to the faculty advisor and I said, oh, I know why you're fighting this. And he's like, what are you talking about? I said, I know something has happened in your history that actually affects the way that you discuss things with your students. And he stepped back. And then he admitted that, that he's very spiritual, but he doesn't lead with that. But there was a moment in his life that he and I related to, and he just stepped back for a moment. I'm like, you know what? I know that because I can see it, maybe other people can see it. And so you might want to just front it or just not completely go completely off the rails on the other direction. And so, I mean, even Dr. Jeff O'Driscoll, who for 25 years was an ER doctor, I said to him yesterday, I said, but you saw these things happening. He's like, but I would have never mentioned it. My colleagues would have made fun of me. I would have never mentioned it in passing or anything like that. I said, well, you did your residents a disservice. I said, because he's like, there's no way there wasn't a place to do it. And Larry Dosey had said the same thing. He's like, I have to, figure out my talks for the crowd that I'm talking to. And I understand it. But I'm not held to the same level as a physician. So I just will be there to remind them that I see what they're about. So then they have to question it. So I think that
you want to encourage others to be as courageous as you are. And you also can understand that under some circumstances, it really could threaten their ability to keep doing what they're doing that's so helpful for people if they lose their credibility. And so, but you want to remind them to, do as much as they can,
because you have to, I hear what you're saying. I'm like, you can absolutely not have to come full on, like, I believe this, but what you can do is say, it's just a theory, but why not come with compassion and just listen to what, without rolling your eyes or without judgment? Why don't we have these conversations with the patients so that they feel welcome to discuss it? Because it's still data. It might not be data they are used to, but it's still information to help them help this patient.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've come up with another question. This is the way that this evening came to be was you reached out and said that you would like to make yourself available for speaking to groups within IANDS. And the question is, do you have any thoughts about working with IANDS on any particular initiative or project?
Well, I hosted a room yesterday last night on Clubhouse, and then I hosted another room, a Zoom yesterday with a bunch of AFE survivors. And what I have found is that a lot of the survivors of maternal traumas that have had near-death experiences didn't have anyone to express it to. And I put a panel together for experts like Dr. Jeff, and my OB, Julie Levitt, was there. And I was like, I need to create the platform so that survivors or experiencers have their voice heard, because what they're getting is roadblocks from their doctors. Either doctors are afraid of litigation, or their clergy don't believe exactly what they're saying. So their families, spouses, they're becoming exes, they're living in this downward spiral, and they have a brand new baby, or they're dealing with the traumas. And then they're dealing with this like amazing and unfathomable gift of feeling at such a higher level and being on a different frequency, which they can't relate to anyone. So we're a group of survivors, and there's a bunch of different maturations of it, where one has lost a baby, they've lost, a spouse has lost the wife and the baby, or just the wife, but the baby survives. And so there's many different versions of this. And they want to know that their loved ones are still around. And it brought them such great comfort. I had about 300 people in the room last night on Clubhouse, I think it was, where people were just afraid to die, and so they just heard from different answers. And in the survivor room, I had, a bunch of women there. They, again, they were afraid of what they were feeling and what they were experiencing, and many had premonitions too. So by the time we were done on both classes yesterday, it was a long day, but both classes, the healing started to begin. The healing began because they felt they were being heard in a safe space. And they felt, even though their doctors were rejecting it, that by having Dr. Jeff or Dr. Julie Levitt there, it was like they were talking to their own doctors indirectly. And so there were lots of tears. There was just like, I finally feel like I'm in a space where I can share this, because I think I'm going crazy. So, I mean, they told me I was a featured speaker. I'm going to be a featured speaker for IANDS for this year's event. I don't know whether it's in person or if it's virtual, but it'll
be virtual.
It'll be virtual. But one of the things that in discussing this with this group was that, there are other people who have experienced it. There's a natural fear of death, and hearing more stories brought a lot of people comfort. And then a lot of people wanted to know, how they go back there. A lot of people wanted to know, were jealous of the fact that we've been there in the first place, because they wanted to connect with their loved ones. And so I think that there's a space for it, especially in the maternal health world. It's very tough coming back, being a brand new mother, getting unplugged, and then expected to just, everybody's grateful you're alive, and now you should be grateful and just go back to being a mother and a wife. and that's next to near impossible.
Mhm. Yeah.
So I think the actual help and the outreach and, will help.
Yeah, you're in a unique position because of your experience to work with this special population of people who've had NDEs, premonitions, and so forth, and who are new parents, whether it's the mother, the father, the whoever, to understand not only the challenge that we all know exists just to be a new parent, period, but then to have this extra thing on top of it of some transpersonal aspect, an NDE, a premonition, maybe after death communication, and to be able to pull all that together for that special population. It's really, it is a unique, you're in a unique position to be uniquely helpful. Yeah.
I think it helps. I think it helps just talking about it. It makes them feel less crazy. And then from the spouse's perspective, they have the spouses to deal with all the chaos.
Yeah.
And it's important. It really is. It'll make a softer landing, like I said, for these women and for the children, because it's really, it took me a moment to connect with my child. It took me a moment to connect with all of my children and my husband. I just felt really out on a ledge and no one was able to touch me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'll say this will be last call. If there's anything else, Stephanie, that you'd like to share here, or anyone here, if there's any question that you'd like to ask, it's a good time to step forward. We have just a few minutes left. Stephanie, anything?
No, that the audiobook came out. If anybody wants to hear my husband's voice, it came out with it. You can get it for free if you have a library card at Hoopla Digital. You can get the paperback and you can get what's a library journal bestseller. So you can get it at the library, any library. You can download the audiobook and at stephaniearnold.net/audiobook. And if you want to see any of the videos and the history of like talking at different places, it's also on the website.
Is it also on all the platforms like Audible and?
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll pull it
Okay.
up so they could see that. Let me see if I have that. Yeah. Let's see. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
That's great.
Thank you.
Well, I want to be the first then to thank you, Stephanie, not just for tonight, but for the work, the way you've made yourself available to IANDS. I think the things that you have to bring are unique and they're valuable. Your perspective on your experience and what to do with it is, you seem to be very grounded in that. And for you to work with IANDS, I think it's a great partnership, and I think it has a lot of road yet to run. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being with us tonight. Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you for having me.
Yep. It was a wonderful evening. And, as much as I've heard your story before, both on the panel that we did and your Netflix series, there's always richer detail that comes out in these kinds of exchanges. And I really appreciate that. And also just to be able to hear the updates about your meetings with the parents and, the group that you talked about. It's great to hear how your work is, the ripples are continuing to go out, but without losing volume the way the ripple effect usually does. Yours is picking up volume. So it's great to hear.
Yeah, we just sold the movie rights. I wrote the screenplay, so
Yay.
we are casting, so that's exciting.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Awesome,
Really neat.
awesome.
Hopefully it'll give people more ideas when to listen to themselves.
Mhm. Mhm.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks. And as Pete said, last call, anyone else want to ask or say anything before we say goodnight? Okay, so not hearing anything, I guess we'll say goodnight. Thank you so much, Pete.
Good night.
Great, thank you very much.